The metaphor, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty, is a philosophical provocation regarding the perspective a person has on life. A perception of the glass being half full indicates positivity and optimism, when a person is dominated by the certainty that everything will work out. But if the feeling is that the glass is half empty, then a negative and pessimistic view of the facts prevails. In the year 1973, from an optimistic perspective, we had important global events, both social and technological. For example, the end of the Vietnam War, the birth of the first cell phone, the Motorola, the inauguration of the World Trade Center in New York, and why not mention the release of the movie The Exorcist? In that same year, however, we lost Pablo Picasso and Bruce Lee, among others. However, we who are captivated by investigative and mystery stories, what might interest us especially is that this year has 3 unusual criminal cases which happened in our country that are famous and highly requested by you here on the channel. The kidnapping and death of Araceli Sanchez Crespo, an 8-year-old girl. The kidnapping of Carlos Ramirez da Costa, known as Carlinhos, a 10-year-old boy. And the kidnapping and death of Lídia Braga, a 7-year-old girl. I'm Marcos, and today I bring you a special video with these 3 cases. If you enjoy it, leave your like, activate the notification bell, and let's get to the facts. Abducted, today's stories have been requested several times by the subscribers of Insolito. Almost 50 years separate us from these 3 crimes, and it's very likely that absolutely everything that could be mentioned about them has already been done. Countless reports, documentaries, and books have told the brief lives of these victims and pointed out the suspects for their deaths. Assuming that the boy also died after the kidnapping, stories of violence and impunity that in 1973 took Araceli, Carlinhos, and Lídia out of the ordinary anonymity of their childhoods and turned them into immortal characters in the world of true crime. So, respecting the chronological order of the cases, here are the main events. Araceli Cabreza Sanchez Crespo was born on July 2nd, 1964 in the city of Cubatão, a little over 60 kilometers from São Paulo. She was the daughter of Gabriel Crespo, a Spaniard, and Lola Sanchez, a Bolivian. The girl had an older brother. The family moved to Vitoria in Espírito Santo because of a job opportunity for Gabriel, which was very healthy for the girl due to the pollution in her hometown and her recurring respiratory problems. On May 18, 1973, a Friday, Araceli disappeared while she was returning home from school. A tragedy when we learned that, at her mother's request, the child was released earlier at 4:10 p.m. so she could catch the bus home.
On Friday, she gave me the note from her mother requesting her early release.
That is, 20 minutes earlier than the other students at São Pedro school. When the girl didn't arrive home at the expected time, Araceli's parents contacted the school and then went to the police to report her disappearance. But the authorities only began the official search 3 days later, on Monday. The parents, however, acted immediately and informed the local newspapers, which began to widely publicize the child's disappearance, quickly making Araceli's name and face known to the public. During that time, the family's hopes for the girl's safe return were fueled by parapsychologists and psychics who claimed that she was alive. However, unfortunately, 6 days later, the dream of a happy reunion was shattered. Araceli's body was found on May 24, 1973, in a thicket near a children's hospital in the city. The body was decomposing, having already been affected by animals and exposure to the elements. The father, Mr. Gabriel, initially identified his daughter's body by a birthmark but later changed his mind. Thus, it was up to the medical examiner's office to confirm that it was Araceli and that she had been the victim of homicide. The report from Nilson Santana's period concluded that the girl had received a fatal dose of sedative medication and that sexual abuse had occurred. including after death. The investigations found witnesses who saw Araceli after leaving school, standing at the intersection of Ferreira Coelho and Cesar Rilao Avenues, in front of a bar, petting a cat. Later, 3 suspects were identified. Paulo Constantin Helal, 27 years old, Dante Barros Michelini, 53, and Dante Barros Michelini Jr., known as Dantinho, 23 years old. They were representatives of the aristocracy of the state of Espírito Santo. The Dante were wealthy and coffee growers, even pioneers in representing the state's coffee producers in the national and international markets. That kind of person from a high socioeconomic class, with strong political friendships, even receiving honors from local governments, with the family name being given to avenues and public places. Paulo's family, on the other hand, has a local tradition as merchants and investors in the hotel and real estate sectors. According to the prosecution's thesis, Araceli was kidnapped by Paulo shortly after she was seen in front of that bar where her bus stop was. Then she was taken to the Franciscano bar at Camburi Beach, owned by Dante Michelini. At that place, supposedly, the girl was kept alive in captivity for 72 hours. There she was drugged, assaulted, and abused at the hands of Dantinho and Paulo. When the excess of sedatives put the girl into a coma and finally led her to death. There were even theories that the girl's body remained in a freezer for a few days while the killers decided what to do with it. Other accusations weighed on the 3 suspects related to influence peddling. This was due to their connections with the local police, who were allegedly negligent in the investigation and protected those involved in the crime, including José Luzero, journalist and author of the book Araceli, My Love, from 1976, presented the facts from a journalistic and investigative perspective at a time close to the crime where it became clear the strength of the defense lawyers for the wealthy young men. Well, during the investigation, there were reports of police bribery, false alibis, and even the deaths of 4 witnesses involved in the case.
I received 2 offers, one from Mr. Dante Michelini directly, for me to bribe one of the main witnesses in the case, the family's former driver, Bertoldo Lima. Soon after, a man named Antonio Rode, who is currently Mr. Dante Michelini's son-in-law, offered me a check for 100,000 cruceros, so that with it I could hire 2 hitmen to assassinate Congressman Clério Vieira Falcão, the main accuser in the Araceli case.
Fortunato Piccin, 17 years old, who died on the same day Araceli's body was found, in whose house evidence of his involvement in the crime was supposedly found. Jorge Michelini, Dante's brother, who was seen several times in the company of Lola, Araceli's mother, at the Franciscano bar. José Homero Diaz, a military police sergeant, who was cowardly executed during a police operation carried out to arrest 2 drug dealers suspected of committing the crime. José Paulo dos Santos, a drug dealer known as Paulinho Boca Negra and the alleged perpetrator of the crime, together with his accomplice Capetinha. In 1977, the case was finally brought to the Common Court and was not sent to the jury court, after being classified as a kidnapping that ended in death, in other words, as a lesser crime. Judge Hilton Silly accepted the prosecution's argument and said he was convinced that the materiality and authorship of the crime had been proven. Thus, Dantinho and Paulo were sentenced to 18 years in prison and Dante to 5 years, in addition to a fine of 18,000 cruzeros. The powerful Michelini family immediately appealed the decision, managing to prevent the arrests. With that, the investigations were resumed, and 5 years later, Judge Paulo Copolio, based on his reading of the 39 volumes of the case, annulled the conviction, and the 3 men were set free. Carlos Ramirez da Costa, Carlinhos, was 10 years old and was one of the 7 children of Maria da Conceição Ramirez da Costa and the businessman João Melo da Costa. He was the owner of the pharmaceutical company Unilever in Duque de Caxias, Rio de Janeiro. On August 2nd, 1973, a rainy Thursday, around 8:30 p.m., Mrs. Maria da Conceição was at home with 5 of her children, Vera Lucia, 15, Carmen, 14, Eduardo, 13, João, 11, and Carlinhos, when the power in the house was cut off, an invasion occurred. The criminal, who entered the house hooded and armed with a revolver, locked the woman and her children in the bathroom. Except for Carlinhos, he also left a ransom note and fled, taking the 10-year-old boy with him. The note was handwritten in block letters, containing Portuguese spelling mistakes and written on ordinary paper. A sheet of notebook paper where the amount of 100,000 cruzeiros was demanded, equivalent to 400,000 reais, which should be paid within 48 hours. João Melo, the father, who was making a delivery in Copacabana, arrived at the location shortly after. With him were his other children, Luciana, 3 years old, and Roberto, 8 years old, and his employee, Abel Alves da Silva. It is reported that João and Abel even chased the kidnapper, who jumped over a wall and entered a thicket with the child. They were the ones who then reported the kidnapping to the military police officers. The note contained instructions for the ransom payment and was released by the press. This, it is assumed, scared the kidnappers, who did not show up at the place where the money was supposed to be handed over.
The kidnapper left this note. Here, the ransom price is 100,000 cruzeiros.
Would make it possible for the boy to return to his family. Many of the reports published at the time seem incoherent and contradictory to us. But to what extent were they really explored by the investigators? We could only say if we had access to the massive case file. For example, Abel Alves da Silva, the employee who was present on the night of the kidnapping, stated that he saw Carlinhos and the criminal get into a red 4-door Volkswagen taxi parked near the boy's house, and that the vehicle left shortly afterward. However, he also reported that he saw a stranger get out of the taxi and enter the thicket. That man, supposedly chased by him and his boss, Maria da Conceição, and the children, denied having seen a taxi near the house when the kidnapper left with the boy. But if they were locked in the bathroom, how could they see? Furthermore, when informing the police about the case, Abel introduced himself as João Melo's neighbor, when in fact he was an employee and lived in Duque de Caxias, Baixada Fluminense. Right after the events, and over the next 5 decades, several false reports about the boy being found were released. In recent years, even DNA tests have been conducted. However, they never successfully matched the supposed remains or people to the boy who disappeared in 1973. After learning about the kidnapping, military firefighters and officers from the 9th Civil Police Precinct went to the scene. At that moment, reporters and journalists were also present. The search took place from 9 p.m. until the early hours of the morning, near the residence and in the forested area. According to Mr. João's indication, that's where the criminal had run. This almost unbelievable story about a young man with an afro hairstyle who handed the ransom note to Vera Lucia, the eldest sister, led the police to suspect the involvement of the family members. The examinations by expert Carlos Eboli also revealed that the note had been written 3 days before the crime. Secondly, the grammatical errors were intentional with the aim of confusing the investigators. For journalist Celso de Martim Siqueira, who was the first person to arrive at the scene of the kidnapping and who followed the entire case, Maria da Conceição, the mother displayed extravagant behavior during the investigation, becoming the main suspect in the crime. On August 4th, following the instructions, João Melo left a package containing money mixed with shredded paper at the indicated location. Undercover police officers and some journalists stayed nearby with the goal of identifying any suspects. However, no one showed up to collect the ransom. The alleged kidnapper made new contact through the number made available to the public 50 years ago, remember? And he set a new location and a new date for the delivery of the money, which should then take place at Gate 18 of Maracanã Stadium. Thus, a strong police operation was organized, but no one showed up and there was never any further contact from the kidnappers. This led the police to conclude that the motivation for the crime was not money. Many other people were questioned and investigated. Take a look at some of them, the directors of the medical clinic next to Carlinhos' house. Because they had offered 60,000 cruzeiros to buy the property, which the police saw as a possible motive for the crime. Kleber Ramos, who worked at that clinic and was allegedly hired to commit the crime in order to force the sale of the property. The person who reported him was Vera Lucia, Carlinhos' sister, who came face to face with the kidnapper. However, the man had an alibi, which was reinforced by the testimony of another person. With that, after 3 days in detention, he was released with a habeas corpus. José da Silva, a mechanic and family friend, who sometime before had problems with João Melo because of a late payment on a loan, in which Carlinhos' father was his guarantor. However, he was not recognized by the family as the kidnapper, Raimundo Pereira Lulu, a man who was supposedly romantically interested in the victim's mother. In this case, Raimundo would have plotted revenge for being rejected by Maria da Conceição. Celso Vasconcelos de Passos and his brother-in-law, Francisco de Almeida, where Celso owed money to Carlinhos' father and unable to pay off this debt, had his car taken by his creditor, which led to a motive for revenge. Another person was Hildebrando Martins de Castro, a stranger who, upon hearing about the boy's kidnapping, offered his own children as substitutes for Carlinhos. Maria da Conceição, the mother, who, exceptionally, on the night of the crime, did not attend the spiritualist session she used to go to every week. The day after her son disappeared, the woman went to the police station, showing complete indifference to the events. It is also reported that she showed up wearing her best wig and well made up, as if she were out for a stroll. The police were informed that Maria was a negligent mother and a selfish woman who liked to spend excessive amounts of money on herself. João Melo, the father, who was going through financial difficulties. In this case, a fake kidnapping could be a good way to raise money. In this regard, we can point out that the family did not have the resources to pay the amount demanded by the criminals. However, 300,000 cruzeiros were raised, 3 times more than the amount demanded. In the following days, the Robbery and Theft Police Department, which was coordinating the investigation, received several false tips by phone. One of them pointed to the address where the hideout was supposed to be. The anonymous tip said that the boy had been seen entering that house. Details such as the vehicle's license plate number were also reported. But it was just another dead end in the investigation. A week after the kidnapping, the police arrested Ademar Augusto de Fraga Filho and a con artist. Within a fanciful theory of personal revenge against Carlinhos' father, and the ransom money would enable these men, who already had criminal records and were wanted by the authorities, to escape internationally. Others who came under the investigators' radar were José Pereira de Brito and Julio de Carvalho. Since years earlier, they had carried out the kidnapping of a boy. In addition to them, 6 men and a woman were arrested, all employees of Dr. Filizola's clinics and the Fleming Institute, both neighbors to Carlinhos' house. At the time, a young woman, an employee of João Melo and a relative of the detained employee, confessed to being the mastermind behind the kidnapping and to having provided the paper used for the note. In this version of the crime, she would use the money to cover a financial shortfall in the company. However, the investigations proved that all of this was unreal. And we end this part of the story with the confession of the robber Adilson Candido da Silva in January of '74, who claimed to have kidnapped the boy at the father's request and that he was dead and his body had been thrown into the sea. A skeleton recovered 6 months after the crime underwent forensic analysis, but it was not Carlinhos. In other words, no evidence. The text of the note seemed like it came out of a fiction story. I'm warning you that the child is in our possession, and we will only return them after the ransom of 100,000 cruceros is paid. This amount must be in small bills and placed inside a bag, and it should be deposited on top of a cement box, which is located on Alice Street at the intersection with Dr. Julio Otoni Street, next to two signs. On the 4th of August, 1973 at 2 o'clock. I mean 2 o'clock on the 4th. And remember that any reaction, the victim will be eliminated. Note, after this deposit is made, you must head towards Rio Cumprido, and this letter must be returned at that moment. Another noteworthy fact was the behavior of Teodoro Murta, commissioner of the 9th Precinct. He was photographed by journalists wearing women's clothes, claiming that he was going to investigate some suspects. Such an initiative resulted in his suspension for 90 days. Also, a group of police officers arrested and tortured Ranulfa da Silva, a woman who had worked at Carlinhos' house, along with Antonio Costa da Silva, known as Pitoco, her ex-lover. The couple was suspected of being involved in the crime because they had been fired 2 years earlier, and this could possibly lead to an act of revenge. Another hypothesis was a crime of passion, where the same Ranulfa da Silva was supposedly taking revenge on João Melo because of a sexual relationship between them. Later, the former employee Antonio da Silva was eventually captured and presented to the press as one of the kidnappers. It was assumed that the kidnapper was known to the family, since the 3 dogs did not react to this person's entry. This individual also knew the location of the fuse box or had been informed about it. It was also suspicious that the side gate through which the kidnapper accessed the house was unusually open that night. Four years after the kidnapping, Vera Lucia, Carlinhos' sister, told the police that she recognized Silvia Azevedo Pereira, an employee at their father's laboratory, as the kidnapper. This was because she recognized a strong smell of pharmaceutical products handled in João Melo's laboratory on the intruding criminal. Graphological examinations were carried out and confirmed that the note had indeed been written by him. In 1985, that is, 12 years after the crime was committed, Silvio Azevedo Pereira was tried and sentenced to 13 years in prison by the 17th Criminal Court. However, his lawyers appealed the sentence and he was eventually acquitted. Carlinhos' parents ended up getting divorced. One of his sisters, with whom his mother lived, stated that for many years the lady, Maria de Conceição, held on to the certainty that her son would return, until she had a dream in which she learned that he was dead. Although the ransom amount was 100,000 cruzeiros, 300,000 cruzeiros were raised. This came from donations from the people who followed this unusual case and sympathized with the family, offering money. This money was never delivered to the kidnappers and also disappeared during the investigation. Ana Lídia Braga lived in the city of Brasilia and, at 7 years old, attended the first year of elementary school in the morning at a private Catholic school in the north wing of the city. However, in the afternoon, on Tuesdays and Fridays, she had tutoring classes and, on the other afternoons, piano lessons. The girl, who was very protected, lived with her father, Álvaro Braga, her mother, Heloísa Rossi Braga, both public servants, her sister, Cristina Elizabeth, who was 20 years old, and her brother, Álvaro Henrique, who was 18 years old. Rosa de Conceição Santana, who had been working as a maid in the house for 20 years, was also part of the family life. On September 11th, the parents, when leaving for work after lunch, dropped Ana Lídia off at the school gate at 10 to 2 in the afternoon. Then around 4:30, Rosa went to pick her up. However, the girl was not there. In fact, according to the school administration, Ana Lídia had been absent that afternoon. Then, with the parents confirming that she had indeed been dropped off at the school entrance, the magnitude of the problem became clear, since she had been missing for a few hours. Later, people said that Ana Lídia never actually entered the school building because a man intercepted her in the gardens, someone the girl certainly knew and whom she calmly went along with. Naturally, her parents, the maids, school staff, and neighbors began searching for her. At the same time, the 2nd Police Precinct was assigned to lead the investigation, also mobilizing other institutions. To give you an idea, even the train bound for São Paulo, which was scheduled to depart at 7:30 p.m. that day, was delayed because the passengers were searched. Unfortunately, at noon the next day, civil police officers found the naked body of Ana Lídia, partially buried on a plot of land at the University of Brasília. The report from the Institute of Legal Medicine stated that the cause of death was asphyxiation, probably caused by suffocation when she was buried alive. This happened between 4 and 6 p.m. on the 12th, that is, hours before she was found. The girl had been a victim of assault and sexual abuse even after death. The fact that her hair had been cut short like a boy's might have indicated an attempt to disguise her identity. Unexpectedly, at 7:45 in the evening, after the parents reported Ana Lídia's disappearance, the chief of police, José Ribamar Moraes, received an anonymous phone call demanding 2 million cruzeiros for the girl's ransom. When she was put on the phone, she cried and called for her mother. At 8 o'clock, Ana Lídia's pencil case was found thrown on a sidewalk. On that same day, in a supermarket near the Braga family's apartment, a handwritten envelope was left for the girl's father with a ransom demand of 500,000 cruzeiros. The instructions were for the money to be left near the Bragueiro Bridge within 72 hours. The police also found the girl's notebooks thrown near the Marine Corps unit. The Susie doll, which she used to take to school, was later found by the daughter of a Marine. But the backpack and the clothes were never found. Regarding the eyewitnesses to the kidnapping, which happened in broad daylight in a public place, the main testimonies were from Benedito Duarte da Cunha, 31 years old, the school's gardener, who recognized Álvaro, the brother, as the man who had taken Ana Lídia. When both of them calmly left through the school's side gate, Diva, Aparecida dos Anjos, 32 years old, a housewife who, while washing clothes in the backyard, saw the girl passing by on the street. Pretty blonde with shoulder-length hair, carrying a backpack, Ana Lídia walks normally, followed by a young man of slightly below average height and wavy hair. Tomé Marcelo da Cunha, 9 years old, nephew of the gardener Benedito, notices when Ana Lídia and the man get into a taxi, a red Beetle, and head toward the University of Brasília. Nair Gomes Pinto, 13 years old, a student from the school who talked to the girl that day and asked if she didn't study in the morning, Ana Lídia replied that she did and explained about the tutoring classes. Nair also said she didn't see anyone else in the back seat of the Braga family's car, information that contradicted Álvaro's alibi. For the police, suspicion quickly fell on him, Álvaro Henrique, the 18-year-old brother. First, because the girl was taken peacefully, certainly by someone she knew and trusted. Also because of the physical description and the clothes worn by the kidnapper. The brother already faced previous accusations of involvement with drugs and suspicions that he owed money to drug dealers. So, was the kidnapping of his sister a way to pay off his debts? In his statement to the police, Álvaro Henrique only admitted to having sinned, occasionally using drugs, and that his sudden need for money had nothing to do with drug dealers, but was related to paying for an abortion his girlfriend had. At the place where the girl's body was found, motorcycle tire tracks were identified that matched the Yamaha 100cc that he used. Although the parents provided an important alibi, stating that their son was in the back seat of the vehicle when they dropped Ana Lídia off at school, both the gardener and his nephew, as you may remember, said that there was no one else in the car besides the couple. The suspects in the crime were the girl's brother, Álvaro Henrique Braga, who, along with his girlfriend, Gilma Varela de Albuquerque, allegedly sold Ana Lídia to traffickers. The sons of two important politicians, members of Brasília's high society, would be involved. Alfredo Bucay Jr., known as Bucaidinho, son of the then Minister of Justice, and Eduardo Ribeiro Rezende, son of a senator who owned the farm where Ana Lídia was held captive. And finally, the so-called Raimundo Lacerda Duque, a well-known drug dealer from Brasilia. The main suspect in the murder was Busaidinho, who did not appear to testify and was represented by his lawyer. Later, he responded to the charges through a letter rogatory when he moved to São Paulo, always denying his involvement in the crime. The key testimony that cleared him from the crime was given by the family's driver, who claimed that on the day of the crime, he took the young man to the doctor. When the other three suspects were called to testify, they denied any involvement in the murder. Ana Lídia's death went to the jury court, but the suspects were acquitted due to lack of evidence in 1975. Busaidinho died in a car accident in 1975 at the age of 19 when he was returning from Ponta Grossa in Paraná. At the time, journalists even insinuated that the death had been staged to get the young man out of circulation, but in 1986, an exhumation confirmed the identity of the buried body. Rezendinho shot himself in the ear in 1990 at the age of 40 in his apartment in Vitória, Espírito Santo. Duque passed away in 2005 after complications caused by alcoholism. The only living suspect is Álvaro Henrique, who some sources say currently lives in Rio de Janeiro, where he works professionally as a doctor. On September 11, 1993, the crime of Ana Lídia Braga's death expired without punishing any culprit. And so, my dear abductees, we've reached the end of this overview of the three most well-known criminal cases of 1973. And they clearly have several elements in common. Don't you agree? However, the striking impunity of the criminals, which also connects these stories, cannot be attributed to the lack of technological resources at the time or to the absence of forensic evidence. What prevailed here, leading to the crimes remaining unsolved, was the smallness of character of many of those involved in the cases. People directly or indirectly connected to the investigations and the proceedings. In other words, an extensive list of liars, greedy people, opportunists, and hypocrites. So, only for those who believe in divine justice, there is the certainty of a reckoning for the lives stolen from Araceli, Carlos, and Ana Lídia. I hope you enjoyed today's content. Regarding other important aspects of the Ana Lídia Braga case, including the censorship imposed during that period by the military government, I recommend you watch the recent video dedicated exclusively to her, made by my friend Daniel from Paralelo Metaforico. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.